Moses had set up back in the wilderness wandering years. And so God is calling them back to a faithfulness to him, a covenant loyalty to his laws, and he's calling them back to justice. Now, what is justice? We discussed this a little bit last week. I want to get into it more this week. Specifically this week. Last week we kind of discussed the passage and what's at stake here in this moment in Israel's history. This week we're going to discuss more broadly what is justice. We're going to look at a bunch of passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Basically we're going to try to construct what's called a biblical theology of justice. A biblical theology is basically going through the Bible and saying, what does the Bible say about justice? What is it? How do we think about it in a biblical sense? And I think this is really important because if you read the news, if you read people who are thinking about the world that we live in today, justice and words like social justice or social justice warriors are really big buzzwords in our culture today. And they're ideologies that we need to think about. How do we approach them biblically? Do we completely say they can't be biblical at all? They're coming from a totally secular agenda, and so there's nothing redeemable about them? Or is there a piece of what they're saying that's true that we need to be sensitive to? Those are basically the questions we're trying to answer here. So we're going to start by asking, what does the Bible say about justice? How do we think about it? So I want to start by just looking a little bit about what is justice. So I'm going to throw that out to you guys first. What is justice? What does that word mean? Is there a difference between justice and social justice? What do you guys think? Yeah.
I think true justice comes from God.
Absolutely.
Social justice is what comes from man.
Okay, sure. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I think social justice could be dictated by a person's worldview.
Oh, absolutely.
If you have a biblical worldview, you're going to look at social justice different than a liberal worldview. For instance,
no doubt.
Abortion will be wrong with a Christian worldview and
right.
other things but if you're looking at a liberal worldview,
it's legal, it's right, and it's a woman's rights.
Right. No doubt it's affected by your worldview. And we'll get to that over time as we think about constructing our view of justice. Yes. Were you raising your hand?
I won't, but I'll say, is justice right or wrong? I mean,
well, that's part of the question. That's what I'm wanting to throw out to you guys to think about. Yes.
I'm not going to answer the question, but it seems like part of the question is recognizing that God's justice is a spiritual thing and social justice is almost entirely a material thing.
Sure, but yes. However, I would argue from the text, and we're going to get to this as we get to other passages in the Old Testament. Micah 3 is saying God's justice says, don't steal from the poor. Don't be keeping food from the widows and orphans. I mean, it's a very practical justice.
What I mean is, I think social justice doesn't have a spiritual aspect, and biblical justice does.
I agree with you. Let's take it a step further. Social justice, as defined by secularists in our culture, doesn't have a spiritual aspect. I would throw out to the room, I'm not going to necessarily defend this wholeheartedly yet, but let's think about it. Let's engage it. Social justice, I would actually agree with Dick on this, that social justice, basically social justice your definition depends on what worldview you're coming from. And so, if you're coming from a secular worldview, it's going to look very different from a biblical worldview. So I wouldn't say it's a term that we should just completely throw away because it's been taken over by the social justice warriors or the people in our culture who are saying you have to be trans and you have to defend the rights of all of these kind of identity politics groups. That it depends on what worldview you're coming from, is how you're going to define the term. So I would say something like what Micah is talking about is a form of social justice that is rooted in a biblical view of God's justice. Does that make sense? The secular view of social justice is rooted in a humanitarian view of humanism that goes back to thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We could discuss the philosophical side of it. I don't know if this is the time or place, but Diderot even, there's philosophical streams that go back to the Enlightenment and before that are a worldview. They're creating a worldview that says man is basically good. Man is a blank slate that's created by his environment. This was Rousseau's idea. And coming from Voltaire and others, that's a worldview that is leading to the kinds of identity politics that we see in the culture. Does that make sense? And there's way more history and philosophy and stuff that we could go into to talk about why they get to where they get. But two key differences is God says man is basically evil because he's fallen, rebelled against God. And there's a moral good, a moral sense of justice, a moral sense of what is right or wrong that exists outside of man and man's social order. Right? A humanist says what is good and right and true and lovely is created inside of, not outside of, a man-made social order. Right? Does that make sense? These are kind of foundational ideas for where we get to why there's such a big difference. They're really kind of bedrock that then lead to the symptomatic. That's why last week I was using the word symptomatic. Symptomatic just means there's, I don't know the medical side well enough, but the root may be cancer cells in your body. The symptoms are you're weak or your hair is bald, like different things that are symptoms. Those aren't the root cause. Those are just the visible things that you're feeling in your body. That's different than what actually is the problem. If you only address the symptoms, you're not going to get very far. You have to address the root causes. So we're going to try to think through some of the root worldview questions as we think about how do we as Christians think about social justice. So here's a proposal, and I want us to engage with this as we think about it biblically. Here's a proposal. What if we agree on many, not all, but many areas of social justice with our secular counterparts? Should we try to alleviate hunger?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Is that something that we as Christians can get behind?
Yeah.
Should we seek to attack those who are behind sex trafficking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Things like that we're going to be in agreement, by and large, with somebody who's coming from a secular worldview, right? But while we are agreeing on the fact that the symptoms need to be resolved, or racism is another word, should we fight white supremacy? Yeah. Okay, there may be disagreement on that, but I would argue, yes, absolutely we should. That is a major symptom, but here's the difference, is we are coming at our reasons for attacking that symptom from two completely different foundations. totally different worldviews. Yes, Brian.
Well, and the way of resolving it is very different.
Absolutely. Yes.
And what the, for the trafficking, how to help those who have been rescued
Right.
is devoid of hope if you don't have Christ.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's where our worldview, even while we're agreeing that these issues need to be resolved, our worldview is going to take us to different ways of resolving them than the worldview of a secularist. Because our worldview says man is basically evil. He's a rebel, fallen from God, who needs the gospel. Without the gospel, no amount of food and clothing and tech and civilization and whatever, all these things that you could give them money, none of that is going to help people at the deepest level. It may help them to a certain extent, but we have to go deeper and give them the gospel and help them be sanctified. Because ultimately, I think we can agree with the Bible when it says, don't fear the man who can kill your body only, but fear him who can both kill your body and send your soul to hell. That's, from a Christian worldview, that is humanity's deepest problem. And so whether you're someone being trafficked or you're a refugee, your deepest problem is not those social economic justice issues, though those are there. Your deepest problem is that you're a rebel who's been alienated from God. Right? Yes.
I was just mulling over the examples that you gave, and actually, a lot of the secular worldview on some of those issues are, in fact, the same biblical worldview, and so I see that as opportunity to say we're coming from this. Wow, you're right. That's a good scriptural biblical view. Yes, we should be doing more of that.
But here's where, for example, I would go deeper. I remember a couple years ago, I was standing in the Boston Commons. I was working with a church plant there over a few months, and they had, you guys may have read about it in the news. It was in July of 2017, but they had about 10,000 people come and protest 6 claimed to be white supremacists. I don't know if they were. I think they were just arguing for free speech. But basically 6 people from the kind of alt-right came out, and 10,000 people from Boston came out to protest them. Boston is super liberal, similar to here in a lot of ways. And I was standing in the midst of this watching. There was actually some Antifa, there was some probably Black Lives Matter people there, and just all the signage going around with go home Nazis, my grandfathers fought the Nazis, we don't want you, that kind of language on all of these signs. It was really fascinating. It's just observing a cultural moment live rather than just what the news is presenting to you. And one of the things I thought is, so the main concern that the protesters had there was the idea that while free speech is good, there's a certain kind of speech that should not be free. Their argument basically was hate speech should not be free speech. Now, that's a political question that we're not going to try to tackle here. But my thought as I'm observing this was, while I agree with you for a different reason. Because my opposition to racism is rooted in the fact that every human being, regardless of race, regardless of country of origin or ethnicity, is created in the image of God. And is so valuable that the Son of God came and died on the cross to give them the ability to be saved. Which is something that no secularist would come from, that kind of a worldview, to argue against racism. But I think we have to go to that depth to say we are against racism for these really deep, profound theological reasons. So while I was in agreement by and large, I wasn't really protesting, I was there more as an observer, just curious what was going to happen. And But I was thinking, I'm largely in agreement with the people here, most of whom I would disagree with on most issues. Abortion, transgender, like those kinds of issues, we would not be in agreement. But on this issue, I agree with them. But I agree with them for different reasons. And that's going to affect how we're going to approach social justice. So, we've kind of looked at a little bit on the cultural side. Again, I don't want to get super political on this. I want us to think about how to apply this. But I want to throw out a few quotes, and then we're going to get to the Bible, and we're going to look at some passages in the Bible. And with this backdrop, I want us to think about what the Bible is saying and how we apply it in our cultural, political moment. As Christians, how do we engage with the world around us in a way that is not ignoring the primacy of the gospel, meaning our primary reason to exist on this earth is as ambassadors of the gospel, not as ambassadors of social justice. Not that we can't do any social justice, but our primary reason to be here is to present the gospel. But let's look at a couple quotes. I want to go back to one of my favorite people from history, Teddy Roosevelt. He actually has some quotes on justice and kind of on social justice. Obviously, one of the reasons I want to go back to him is he's living in a different cultural political moment. So he's not breathing the air that we're breathing. And so we can kind of go back. It's nice to look at older guys and gals sometimes because they have a different perspective. They're not necessarily right on everything, but their errors are different errors because they're not necessarily breathing in the same cultural confusion that we are, that can distract us. So he writes, first of all, justice consists not in being neutral between right and wrong. Let's pause there for a second. This is something I'm not perfect in this. I'm trying to wrestle with these issues myself, but I think there's a danger as Christians that on these kinds of issues we stand back and say, I'm not going to take a side on this. I'm just going to let the secular culture battle this out on its own. I think, and I want to open this up for you guys to engage with too, but I think Roosevelt has a good point here when he says, justice consists not in being neutral between right and wrong. You can't just sit on the fence and stand off. But finding out the right and upholding it wherever it is found against the wrong. Would you agree? Would you say that that is a good definition of justice? Yes or no? Or other questions or thoughts?
What's that last part again? But finding out the right and upholding it?
I'll repeat the whole quote. He says, justice consists not in being neutral between right and wrong, but finding out the right and upholding it wherever found against the wrong.
I like it.
Yeah.
At one point he says, but finding the right. Who's right?
Well, that's the question that's begged here. Right? And this is the worldview difference. This is where the worldview difference comes in. Because we're coming from different worldviews, we're going to have different views of what is right and wrong. The secularists say it's socially constructed. Whatever the community agrees is right is right. Or, you've got different branches of liberal, if you want to get really nerdy, there's this fantastic book. A couple of years ago, I was kind of curious to read what do really thoughtful non-Christian writers have to say about justice, because it's such a big issue. And so I found there's a professor from Harvard whose name is Michael Sandel, really brilliant guy. And he takes the three different streams of thinking about justice and discusses them. The first is utilitarianism, which says what is best for the most people. The second is libertarianism, which says what basically, whatever makes you happy and doesn't cause anybody else harm. That's a really tricky. Basically, he shoots them both out of the water. As a non-Christian, completely destroys both of those streams of thought. They don't work. They're completely illogical when you take them to the end. Brilliant book, if you ever want to read it, called Justice, What Makes Right by Michael Sandel. The third one he argues for is basically a moral order that is either community constructed or some kind of religiously imposed, not imposed quite, but basically this would be what Christianity would fall under, or a Muslim view of morality, or it's a pretty broad last category, but basically it's something where society agrees, whether it's from the Bible or somewhere else, but society agrees on a set of rules and then enforces them. And he argues that that's the best way to think about justice. And now, that stream of thinking about justice is broader than what we would be comfortable with, because we're going to go back to saying it has to be rooted only in the Bible. Not only in it has to be rooted ultimately in the Bible, right? But it was interesting to see how even he has to argue, you can't just go individual, kind of the postmodern idea. Do you guys know what postmodernism is? Sorry, this is turning kind of into a weird philosophy class too, but basically, postmodernism or relativism, just to define terms here, is the idea that everybody gets to make their own choice on what is right and wrong. So you may have heard, my truth is true for me, your truth is good for you, we can be okay on that. That doesn't really work. And even secularists like Michael Sandel can show that that doesn't work. You don't have to have a biblical worldview to recognize that that doesn't end up real well. But, so you're kind of left with two options. With the option of the question of how do you construct how do you socially construct a view of morality that everybody can agree upon without rooting it in something like the Bible? And that's the question that the secularists are left with. That's not really our issue, because we're rooting it in the Bible. We have an authority for what justice is. Let's move on. We can come back if you have questions. Roosevelt has a second quote that I think is worth engaging with, where he says, "Love of peace is common among weak, short-sighted, timid, and lazy persons." You've got to love Roosevelt. And on the other hand, courage is found among many of evil temper and bad character. Profound thoughts, right? So he's saying, just saying that you're peaceful or just saying that you are courageous does not automatically make you right or just. Can we agree on that? Okay? Neither quality shall by itself avail. Justice among the nations of mankind and the uplifting of humanity can be brought about only by those strong, daring men who with wisdom love peace, but who love righteousness more than peace. What do you guys think about that?
Well, he adds another ingredient into it now.
Mm-hmm. You sure does.
Which is, and when you look at the term, through the Old Testament at least, many times justice and righteousness are there together.
Yes, and that's what we're going to see as we go through these biblical passages, is that justice and righteousness, and they are two different terms in the Hebrew, they are often parallel. Hundreds of times across the Old Testament, you've got mishpat, which is your justice, and tzaddik, which is your righteousness. Those are parallel in the Bible, and we're going to look at that. So, I've got a few more quotes from Christian writers thinking about justice. We'll get to that probably next week, we'll see. For today, I want to start jumping into the Bible so that you don't go home and are like, all we talked about was secular philosophy. Sunday school, I'll start bringing rotten tomatoes to throw at me. But it's like, we don't care, stop. don't discuss postmodernism. Okay.
Well, at least you have humor.
That would not be just, though.
That is true. So, we're going to start in Deuteronomy 16:19. And if you want, I can give you this list of passages that we're going to go through if you want it later. But that's true. You need to keep reminding me. I'm sorry. I can actually print that off today and give it to people. Deuteronomy 16:19. So this is where Moses is just beginning, kind of the beginning of giving the law, where everything that we're going to read later is going to refer back to these sections of what the law is and what justice is. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are really central to understanding the rest of the Old Testament, because everything else, whether in the history of the kings or in the prophets, everything else refers back to what is laid down in the early books of the Pentateuch, especially the sections on the law. So, Moses, speaking for God, says, "You shall not pervert justice." Okay, begs the question, what is justice? He's going to get into that. "You shall not show partiality," favoritism. "And you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of righteousness." Notice the parallelism here, justice and righteousness. Those are both present in this text. "Justice, and only justice, you shall follow." We're going to discuss what that means as we go forward here. "That you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you." Now, notice, like we talked about last week, this is rooted in a context that's specifically talking to the nation of Israel. This is not given to the church. We need to recognize that up front. This is not a command that's given to the church. Now, the principle that's here is absolutely true for the church, and we're going to see that in the New Testament, that there are ramifications that we need to not ignore. But it's given to Israel, and it's rooted in, if you don't do this, your inheritance of the land is going to be voided, right? And we'll see that, or actually, this is part of what Micah is going back to. Is he saying, remember that covenant you all swore to and said you were going to be faithful to? Remember that covenant here in Deuteronomy? Leviticus, Numbers, that section of the Bible? You guys have betrayed it. When you didn't follow justice, that's what Micah is saying here in Micah Chapter 3. When you didn't follow justice, when you didn't obey the law, when you didn't stay faithful to God, you wrote yourself out of the covenant. And it is only by God's grace and mercy that He hasn't wiped you off the face of the earth years ago. And that He's going to still show love and mercy to the remnant of Israel that's going to be brought back from Babylon. That's essentially what Micah is saying, and what he's going to say as we read the rest of the book.
Andrew?
But yes.
I was wondering, should you include verse 18 because that's about the judges?
Yes. Let's go ahead and read that one if you don't mind.
"You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment."
Mm-hmm. Right, and again, you see the righteousness and the judgment are both. Those two words are totally intertwined all throughout the Old Testament.
So you can see it depends on the leadership too.
Absolutely.
That it works. That's how that works.
Right, which is interesting. Going back to Micah, I mean, listen to what he says, verse 1. "Hear you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Judah." He's indicting the leadership, first of all. In verse 5, thus says the Lord concerning the prophets, who lead my people astray and cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against him who puts nothing in their mouth. God is indicting primarily, specifically the leaders, the priests and kings and judges and prophets. And that goes back to the covenant that he set up in the Pentateuch. Any questions before we go jump past that passage? Or comments or thoughts? Okay, let's jump to then Psalm number 10, and we'll read verses 17 and 18. And yeah, thank you, George. If you guys are seeing, to try to keep this in a reasonable time frame, and we're going to go again past this week on this, but I've only picked a couple verses out of some of these passages, but if you guys are reading beyond in the passages and want to know other verses that are here in the Bible that you think are relevant, feel free to shout it out, and we can read other. It's Psalm number 10, verses 17 through 18. Yes. And David says, "O Lord," by the way, this is what, spoiler alert, or teaser trailer, I guess, this is what we're going to be at on Wednesday. We are in Psalm 10, so we will discuss this more. But he says, "O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear." Notice the subject here, right? Second person, referring to God. You, not we, you will incline your ear to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that man who is of the earth may strike terror no more. What do you guys think about that verse? Pretty straightforward, right?
Well, he's on the side of the oppressed, not on the side of the arrogant and those who cause terror and inflict pain and suffering to the oppressed. He's not.
Right.
He's against them.
Yep, and that is a significant theme that we're going to see throughout the Old Testament. That God defends the vulnerable and he defends the oppressed. And specifically, fatherless, the orphans, the widows, and the foreigners. And what's interesting is God theologically argues for those groups, saying, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You were foreigners. You, the nation of Israel, were foreigners. I brought you, took you. Again, we'll get to Ezekiel 16 one of these days. I highly recommend you guys read and think about Ezekiel 16 as a theological background to what God is saying in these passages. I promise you one of these days we will take a couple Sunday schools and just really engage with that passage. It's super important. But God is saying, I took you and brought you to be my people. And you should show that same kind of love and care and justice to the foreigners who are living in your land. And on the slavery issue, God says, you were slaves in Egypt, you people of Israel, so you'd better treat your slaves well. Now, another messy issue. God doesn't completely forbid slavery. And in our cultural moment, in a lot of ways as Christians, it would be much easier to argue for the Bible if he did, if there was just a flat out, thou shalt not own slaves. But the fact of the matter is, God doesn't. Now, he talks about treating slaves well. I think there's a number of reasons why societies before our modern society didn't eliminate slavery. One is that they didn't have washers and dryers or dishwashers or running water. Like, it was a different social world. And I'll never forget, my aunt and uncle went to work as Wycliffe Bible translators in Indonesia, and they were way out in the rural islands. And one of the things that they told us when they came back that really shocked them about the culture there was, as white Americans perceived as rich, comparatively, because they're from America, and if you live in most other countries of the world, if you're from America, you're rich. You just are. It doesn't matter if you're from the hood in Brooklyn, you're rich if you're from America. That's just especially if you're white, that's just the perception of other people in the world. And they actually learned as they were there that if they didn't hire a servant, they would be seen as greedy and stingy. Because the social cultural reasoning of the people there was, you are denying someone a job. And by the way, here's the interesting social world that they're living in. The person that they hired, her husband was working for a Chinese fishery, standing knee-deep in ice packing fish every day. His feet are just not doing well. I mean, it's an awful job. You think your job is bad, his is a billion times worse. And this gal that they were hiring was making more money than her husband, working as a part-time servant for my. So all that to say, how we think about, not to say that slavery is ever right. I'm not at all saying that. But there's social and cultural parameters that we have to take into account when we think through some of these issues, and why God doesn't just make a blanket statement that it's wrong. But he does say we need to treat foreigners with justice.
Andrew,
Go ahead, George.
we had a similar experience in Bangladesh. We had servants in our house, and so did our neighbors.
Yeah.
But if you saw the difference in how the servants were treated, the salaries they got, the hours they had to spend, it was night and day. Sure, I had to help because I was going to say anything, golly. But anyway, I mean, it's really that different. And if even the working conditions, you can. I mean, it depends on the families that you're with and everything. I bet, like you were saying, your aunt and uncle treated that lady.
Oh, very well, and had a good relationship with her. We're good friends.
But the Chinese guys down the street there with the factory vice.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I mean, he's not a slave, but his working conditions are just appalling. I mean, in some ways, it's no better than slavery. Yeah. And so I bring up that example, and I'm glad you've had similar experiences, so you've seen, but it's not so much about the labels that we stick on things, right? Is slavery wrong? Yes, it is. But the reality is more important than the labels. And the question comes down to justice. How do you treat people? And that's why even Ephesians talks about, right? In Ephesians 5, 6-ish, where it's going through the husbands, love your wives submit to your husbands, children obey your parents. That section also has slaves obey your masters, and masters treat your slaves with justice, right? So these are real issues that the people are grappling with. And Paul writing to Christians, what's interesting, he's not just writing to the upper crust. Most of the Christians in Paul's days are servants or slaves. Most. And so Paul could have said to these folks who are servants and slaves, break the chains, rise up, revolt against your master. Now, it probably wouldn't have worked. Spartacus's revolution, which is a slave revolution in a similar time period in the Roman Empire, doesn't work. The Roman and Greek empires, which are very enlightened in many ways, civilizationally, according to historians, they were completely structured, they were dependent on slavery. That was a big, their civilization would not have survived without slavery. And that was true of every civilization that was around them. So, But what Paul does say, primarily to slaves, and maybe a few masters, is obey your masters as you would obey the Lord. And then he's telling the masters, treat your slaves in a just way, because, and here's his theological justification, is to the masters, you also have a master in heaven to whom you will give account. So if you're beating your slave, or your servants, or in our modern area, your employees, if you're not treating them well, you have a master who is Jesus Christ to whom you will give account. And so, don't just think you can run high horse over your slaves. You can't. You report to God, and he cares about those slaves just as much as he cares about you. And that's a theological argument for justice that's made in the Bible. Questions on that? What do you guys think? Yes, Ryan. Oh, okay. Okay, you guys ready to keep going, or have any questions? I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you here. Let's keep track. Okay, we've got 10 more minutes. We'll get through a couple more verses. So, in Psalm 106, verse 3. Now, this one isn't going to bring a lot of new information into it, but just, I want you guys to get an idea. I'm not just picking one or two verses, proof texts out of the Bible. This is all over the place in the Bible. These are only a sampling of what's here, yes. It is Psalm 106, verse 3. He says, blessed are they who observe justice, who do righteousness at all times. Again, justice and righteousness are married here. Always. It's all over the place in the Old Testament. They're both together. Justice, to do justice is to be righteous. We're going to see that, by the way, one of the most famous passages, the most famous passage in the book of Micah, and probably the most famous passage on justice is in Micah Chapter 6, verse 8. We'll get to that in a little bit. But blessed are they who do justice, and those who do righteousness at all times. They're together. In Proverbs chapter 21, verse 3. It says, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice.
What did you say, Proverbs 21?
It is Proverbs 21, verse 3.
Oh, verse 3.
What do you guys think about that?
Well, when the Israelites were busy rebelling against God, they were still participating in worship and sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's meaningless.
Right.
When we don't, and so the same is true when we are involved in just churchy things or religious things for the sake of appearance or to please someone, when we're not really seeking after God. And so
yeah, absolutely. And you see this theme over and over again in the Old Testament. Psalm 50 talks about it. The whole psalm is basically saying, God doesn't need your sacrifice. By the way, that's the context. You guys have heard the phrase, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. That's the context that kind of what comes from, is saying God has access to all the animals that you could ever want to slaughter to him. He doesn't need your sacrifices. The reason that the sacrifices can be pleasing to God is when they are done in a context of justice and righteousness. If they're not done in that context, they're an abomination to him and they stink. You have to do the works of worship in the context of works of righteousness and justice. That's what this verse is saying, and that's what throughout the whole Bible we see. Questions on that? Okay, let's keep going. In Proverbs chapter 28, verse 5, it says, evil men... Sorry, I should let you guys get there first, but that's... Proverbs 28, verse 5. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it a little? In all things, or completely. So, we're talking about how do we think about justice? How do we understand it in our cultural moment that is so complicated, tangled? The Bible says if we are seeking the Lord, we will understand justice in all things. In all things, does that mean all things except for the racial issues? In all things except for the transgender issues? What does it say?
All things.
In all things. So, apparently, biblically, we can think through these really complicated issues from a biblical worldview. As we seek God, He will help us to understand them at a greater depth. Okay, I think maybe we've got time for one more. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Isaiah is just rife with thoughts of justice. Micah, by the way, has been called the little Isaiah. So what we're learning in Micah, you see at greater length in Isaiah. Basically, for every one chapter in Micah, you get 10 in Isaiah. So you think we're covering a lot of stuff in Micah. Wait till we get to Isaiah. One of these years, we will get into Isaiah. It's probably my favorite book of the Bible. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. What do you think? What do you notice in that passage?
Get rid of evil, make yourself clean in His sight.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things here is, from this passage, would we be able to say that justice is a part of or connected to holiness? Is that what this passage is teaching? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a part of repentance.
Absolutely.
Because He's telling them, remove the evil of your deeds. So that must mean that they were doing evil deeds before repenting. So
yeah. And what are the examples of the injustice that are given in this passage? There's 3 of them at least. There's very specific examples that are given here in these 2 verses.
Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice.
Well, specific examples though. Those are more of the principles.
Oh, yeah.
What are the examples that are given
yourself
here?
clean, remove evil.
Those are more of the principles though.
Bring justice to the fatherless.
Yeah.
Plead the widow's cause.
Yeah.
Defend your
And correct oppression. Don't be oppressing the poor, specifically. Right? 3 specific examples. Right? And this is where we're going to work as a church. Maybe I should wait to talk about this till next week because we're going to cover it in announcements, but go ahead, Brian.
Well, I think some of what God is so upset about here is they aren't caring for the fatherless or the widows, but they're doing church. They're coming with their sacrifices. Right. It's like, okay, God, everything's great with us. We're doing everything we're supposed to do. And he's saying, no, you're not.
Right. They're good people. They think, right? They're like the Pharisees. They think that they're doing what's right. They think that they're clean and holy before God, and they're doing all of the church things. They're not wicked people who are going and hanging out in prostitution rings and stuff. They're thinking, we're clean, we're holy. But God is saying, no, you're not, because you're not paying attention to these justice issues. And I care about them. So, we'll cover more passages next week. We're out of time for today. But I hope that gives you a flavor for the issues that are at stake and kind of a taste for how we should think about it biblically. And we'll get to more passages. Feel free to ask me questions once we're done, or for next week. Bring questions, bring other passages that you're looking at. I want us to really think through this issue deeply, because my goal is by the end of this class that you could have someone who's not coming from a Christian worldview stop you in an elevator and say, what do you believe about justice? How would you as a Christian approach some of these issues that are floating around in our culture? And that you would be able to give them at least some summary of how we need to think about these issues. That's my goal. So let's pray, and then we will move on. God, thank you for this time that we were able to study your word together. Thank you for your righteousness and your justice in the world, that you care about the issues that we care about or should care about. And I pray that you would just help us as we seek to know you more, seek to be more like you, we seek to be holy, that we would also seek to be just in everything we do, and that we would know how to navigate these complicated issues in the world that we live in a way that shows that we are your children, and that people would see both our love for them and our desire to be just, and that most of all they would see your justice and they would see Christ and his gospel alive in us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys. Good discussion.
So, how do you think